and welcome. This week we're going to have the third video in the series, Defining Objective Personality Terms. And so our focus will be the cognitive functions. What are they? How are they similar and different? Cognitive function was originally coined by psychologist Carl Jung, and so what we're going to be talking about here is not Carl Jung's definitions of the cognitive functions, but objective personalities take on the cognitive functions. So sometimes you might be hearing other people talk about cognitive functions. They might be defined a little bit differently depending on the system that you're focused on. So the first question I asked myself was, why are they called functions? And I'm sure that Carl Jung has an explanation of why he chose that particular terminology in order to describe it. I know math functions and how they work, and it very much aligns with how cognitive functions work. Mathematical functions follow a set of rules or behaviors that allow them to become predictable. And the same with cognitive functions. So with a mathematical function, you would be able to put in an input and predict what the output is going to be. Again, same with a cognitive function. If presented with a particular stimuli, then the cognitive function will respond in a predictable manner, whatever that manner would be. And humans, we like to think of ourselves as unpredictable, but even when we are being unpredictable, that becomes in a sense predictable. So some people like to follow the rules and that becomes their predictable behavior, whereas some others don't like to follow the rules and that becomes their predictable behavior as well. So some things to keep in mind based on what was discussed in previous videos is, number one, everyone can do everything. And so even though I'm going to be mentioning a lot of different behaviors and we all do all of those behaviors, some of them we do more than others. Also, behavior is based on the positive and negative associations we connect to a particular stimuli or situation. And the four letters, which is sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, are the four categories in which the decisions and observations are being made. So in the past, I have been talking about an internal focus and an external focus. And so what we have there is a dichotomy of what in psychology and the cognitive functions we call introverted versus extroverted. We're referring to the thinking, the feeling, the sensing, and the intuition. And so what we are possibly looking at is our own thoughts and feelings or observations, like sensory data, intuitive data, or we're looking at others or the world's thoughts and feelings and sensory data and intuitive data. So those four functions will become 8, and I would say that all introverted functions have very similar characteristics, and all extroverted functions have similar characteristics. I looked at 5 different aspects of the introverted function versus the extroverted function and how they appear or how they behave. First, focusing on the action of each one, we have the introverted function is organizing. Other ways to describe that would be constructing, building, and stacking. And then when it comes to the extroverted function, that one is working towards gathering or accumulating. You're going to notice that a lot of these are going to be opposites. So when it comes to organizing, you're looking at what you have already and putting some order to it. Versus gathering is you're bringing in and not really taking the time to organize it. So because of that, the introverted function will reject new things, possibly reject outside things, and therefore decrease what it is bringing into the consciousness, but then also decrease even still the items that are in the consciousness and then whittle it down even further. For the extroverted function, by default, because it is accumulating and not creating order, then what happens is more of a disorder type feel, a more scattered type feel. So the next characteristic we're going to look at is the purview, or the range in which it functions by. For the introverted function, you see that it's limiting. It's a very narrow range. And for the extroverted function, it is expanding. It is growing. It is a broad spectrum. The next one, the characteristic, a point of view. And for the introverted function, it is considered subjective because it is from the person's own database. And so it is their own thoughts and feelings, their own observations, versus the extroverted function is it's taking it from the world's database. It's more broad, so that means it is pulling from what is reality, what is out there, what is the outside world saying, doing, thinking, feeling. All right, and I thought to add maybe a visual to it because it's helpful to kind of see it in a picture format. I would describe the introverted function as being deep and bottomless. It's just like an abyss. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper. Versus the extroverted function would be wide and limitless, and it just keeps expanding out forever and ever. At least potentially it could. For both of these, the potential is there to do that. So that would be the two major categories and how they behave, or their characteristics. I think a good analogy for the order versus the disorder when it comes to all the functions is when we're looking at the game of Jenga. So when we're looking at Jenga, we have two different moments, right? We have the moment where the Jenga blocks are all put together. They're all set up and they're ready to be played. And so when they're ordered like that, in stacked up, constructed, ready to be analyzed, as you're poking and you're trying to understand the Jenga tower, then you are noticing that some pieces are harder to move, some pieces are easier to move, and that analyzation and comparison, compare, contrast, and really understanding that Jenga tower at that moment, that's more of the organizing functions, because they're built, they're stacked, you understand the relationship between each one of those puzzle pieces to each other. Then what we have in the other state of Jenga is when all the pieces have fallen down and they're all on the floor and there's no longer an order. Is now disordered, it's scattered. Each one of those pieces has the same weight as every other piece. And so that would be more of the objective view when it's all spread out like that, versus the more subjective view when you have it all stacked and organized. If I were to take the characteristics of each, the extroverted function versus the introverted function, I would compare them in that their goal is to still understand something, but they come at it at a different way. So an introverted function is going to come at it by really zeroing in, honing in on the smallest little component in order to understand something and build off of that from there. Whereas the extroverted function, the goal is to compile as much and get as big and wide of an entity as possible in order to understand from there. And so they're kind of going about it in just the opposite direction, but the goal again is still to understand whatever it is that they are, and you are, and I am trying to work at that particular time. So we have the 4 areas that split up and break into 8 cognitive functions. Just like in mathematics, we have a different kind of nomenclature that we use to help symbolize what we're talking about. And so I've created a table that kind of synthesizes all the information that we've been talking about. So with sensory, we have the internal versus the external, whether it's organized or gathered. And so we would call it introverted sensing versus extroverted sensing. And there is the bottom row is the nomenclature that we would use, the symbols. And the same goes for intuition, NI versus NE, feeling, FI versus FE, thinking, TI versus TE. So I thought it would be helpful to go through one of the cognitive functions and just know that what I'm doing for one of these, you can replicate to all of the 8, depending on if they are introverted versus extroverted. So let's go ahead and take a look at TE. So TE would be an extroverted function. That means that the thinking, the thoughts, the rationale, the logic, is the reasons, all those things are coming from the outside world. Someone who focuses on extroverted thinking is not only just focused on thinking in general when it comes to logic and reasons, that is something that they want in their life, but they seek that from the external world. If I go through that checklist, then an extroverted thinker would be gathering the reasons and rationale that others have. So they might ask somebody, why did they think that? Why did they do that? Give me your reasons. I'd love to hear them. That kind of thing. And there is somewhat of a disorder to that because they're not necessarily going to rank every single one of them. They might have all these different rationales, but not necessarily have ranked them in a particular order. So there's that disorder and scatteredness of it. It is broad, and therefore it is considered objective because it is going outward to figure out what is everyone else thinking, what is everybody else's reasons. And essentially it could keep going on and on depending on the purpose and the ideas of whoever is asking the questions and wanting the answers. They could keep going and never stop looking for those answers if it is something that they continue to focus on. So that is my example how the extroverted thinking would behave and based on those different characteristics. That's where we're going to stop here. We could get a little more detailed, but I think we'll save that for another video when it comes to how do these coins now work together, because there is a pattern, there is a formula that we will use. And so we'll get into that in the next video. But hopefully you had a chance to kind of understand what are the similarities and differences between the introverted functions and the extroverted functions, and see how they can apply to each of the 4 letters: sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling. And you're starting to kind of get an idea maybe of where you fit in the spectrum. What do you have a major focus on? And what maybe do you have a minor focus on? So I hope that you join me next time when we look at something different. And with that, I will say goodbye. This will be the 3rd of a series of the definitions. Somebody is vacuuming. I wonder if they're free to do my house next. Well, sounds like you're probably going to hear that.